Adam, how are you today?
Wonderful. Great to be here, Isaac. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. My name is Isaac Stonefish. I'm an associate editor at Foreign Policy Magazine in DC, and I'm here with Adam Cathcart, who's a lecturer in history at Queen's University in Belfast and editor of the blog Sino-NK. And we're going to talk about what the hell is going on with North Korea and how do we understand, to the best of our ability, when they mean what they say. So I think that's a good place to get started. There's been a lot of bluster coming out of North Korea past couple of weeks, past couple of years, past couple of decades. How do you parse which of the statements have any life in reality and which are just complete bluster?
Sure. Well, I think the blustery one is, Isaac, is that they'll hit the United States with nuclear weapons. I mean, they don't have the ability, no proven capability to do that yet. And so that's very much bluster. The very strange element there is that while you would imagine this would be good for their domestic propaganda, in fact, the sources that we see coming out of North Korea are people are scared. I mean, there's a discussion about preemptive nuclear strikes by the United States on North Koreans, and this is a really so they've thrown this out there, but I would argue that they've really misused it. This notion of hitting the United States with preemptive strikes or with nuclear strikes at all. And then the other thing that they've done, Isaac, is to say that they have these kind of Korean weapons and nuclear weapons in a Korean style, kind of small, light, tactical, I think, nuclear weapons. And that's not entirely new in terms of how they would use them. They have discussed before using nukes on the battlefield to prevent advances north, using nuclear weapons on their own soil, in other words. And they're perfectly capable of that now.
Adam, what makes a nuclear weapon in Korean style?
Well, that's what I would like to ask international crisis group people like Daniel Pinkston, and there's people at Nautilus Institute who are working on this as well. I mean, what exactly does that mean functionally? I think what it means is that my interpretation of that, Isaac, is that it's about going back to Kim Il-sung's kind of guerrilla style, small, quick, light, you hit and you run away kind of stuff. There was a really interesting photograph released of the Pochonbo battle on the day that a lot of this was being announced, and the Pochonbo battle is,
please tell us what that means, because I have no idea what that means.
Well, it's an important element in North Korean propaganda, and it's Kim Il-sung's one successful attack on Japanese positions in Korea, on Korean soil, during the sort of the guerrilla period when he was out in the wilderness in Manchuria. And why does that matter? The stories that North Koreans tell about their own history, I would argue, are important to pay attention to, because there are little clues embedded in there about their intent and how they see themselves. So Pochonbo is, Kim Il-sung went across the river, shot up a police station. You can go there and see the bullet holes if you're a North Korean getting patriotic education. And then they ran away, but he gave a couple speeches supposedly. And it's a way of saying we can go into the enemy's stronghold and, force them to pay a price, make them look bad. And then we can pull back and we still survive. So survival is a really important element in, I would argue, in North Korean strategic thought. And that's, in a way, that's how they define victory, is just by sticking it out.
Well, speaking of survival, I mean, there's been, over the past couple of weeks, a few high-profile messages from Chinese sources that maybe China is not too crazy about propping up North Korea anymore. I know it's up for debate how much influence China has over North Korea. I mean, on the one hand, they do have, I think it's about $6 billion worth of trade and probably tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of aid. On the other hand, I mean, Chinese have said that they're as clueless about what's going on in North Korea and have as little influence as the rest of us. So what are your thoughts in terms of China's ability to prop up North Korea and its desire?
Well, I think they still definitely, the things that I'm reading very much are in the kind of sense that they want to keep things going they want to keep the North Korean state afloat. They're talking about normalizing the relationship with North Korea in the sense that they won't abandon the DPRK completely, and they don't want to see it collapse. But they're definitely have found themselves in a real quandary when it comes to denuclearization. Keeping the state alive is fine, but it's another thing if you have, as they've now been talking about openly, loose nukes or nuclear accidents in North Korea. What if North Korea decides to launch a nuclear weapon and is itself nuked by the United States? You're talking about radioactivity that leaks into China, et cetera. I mean, they're openly discussing this kind of thing now. And I think that that's indicative of, the debate inside of China about denuclearization. Is that even a goal? Is it even possible anymore? So I think that China's really, they've lost a lot of, if that's a goal that they walk away from or that they refuse, that they sort of stop talking about, I would argue that's a big victory for the North Koreans to get China to accept the nuclear program as a permanent fact. I think that's a very serious problem from the Chinese perspective, but one that they seem slowly, rhetorically speaking, to be giving up on.
So if China accepts that North Korea is going to have nukes, which I think the United States is coming around to accepting and realizing that there's very little that they can do to get North Korea to give up its nukes, what other options does China have?
Well, I mean, you've seen them support increased sanctions at the United Nations, this third round sanctions, and it's more, supposedly they'll have bigger bite. We're talking about more detailed inspections at the border, fewer luxury goods and things of that nature. And then you've got some information coming out about grain exports this month that have gone down, et cetera. I would argue that you need to look at this in the long-term point of view, 5 months, 6 months, the next 5 or 6 months, because there's so much trade that's going on at the border, and there's so many joint projects right now. You're talking about special economic zones in the northeast, but you're also talking about special economic zone near Sinwichu and Dandong, right on the North Korean border, not so far from Liaoning province and Dalian. And if that construction stops, then it's a big deal. But if China keeps going with this land that they've leased 2 islands for 60 years, then all these other things I think can. There's an answer for the Chinese and the North Koreans. You reroute your trade, or you're doing banking on the special economic zone instead of in Macau. The northeastern victory over the southerners.
I mean, I feel like the trade that China does with North Korea is so insignificant, even for the 3 northeast provinces that are near North Korea, that it is completely a strategic issue. It's a question of, will North Korea collapse, and if so, will that mean thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of refugees flowing across the Yalu River? Does that mean a unified Korea, which might be less pro-China than North Korea is? Does that mean agitation with the Korean minorities on the Chinese border? I mean, do you have any sense of whether or not Xi Jinping, who became president of China today, actually, Mazel Tov, Xi Jinping, and it became chairman of the Central Military Commission in November and Communist Party chairman in November. But do we have any sense of if he feels any different towards North Korea than his predecessor?
Sure. Well, that's a wonderful question. In terms of economics, just really quickly, Isaac, the South Korean trade with China, you're absolutely right. I mean, South Korean trade with China dwarfs the trade with the DPRK, and they can get their minerals out of North Korea, and that's primarily why the North Koreans haven't been totally buried by a Chinese trade deficit, because something like $2.5 billion in precious metals were taken out of North Korea. And I think the argument that China wants to protect this, and they're worried that if the South Koreans unify Korea, they won't have access to these minerals anymore, I think that's overblown. The discussion about unification, I think, that's huge, and it's very, very important. And that's what we've seen a shift on, I would argue, in Chinese media and Chinese scholars talking about this in the last year in particular. It seems obvious. If they could get to a unified Korea that's based and headquartered in Seoul, there is no more DPRK. China can live with that, and I think China can see there would be a lot of benefits in that. The problem is, as you mentioned, how do you get there without hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of refugees? I've done some studies of the refugee issue during the Korean War, and we always imagined that there were waves of refugees going across. But in fact, China held the border and controlled it pretty strongly. You're talking about 10,000 here, 10,000 there. I mean, look at what's been going on in the Myanmar-China frontier recently. I mean, China can handle this, I think. And there are a couple working papers recently about China's emergency response capability and things of that nature. So I think the idea that they just completely would freak out and they would have no idea what to do, and this would cause a massive influx of refugees, I think that's questionable. But there's more to be said about Xi Jinping, and there's more to be said about the Korean minority. But I think that's certainly the question of unification is one that the Chinese are thinking about quite a lot, and rethinking historically as well. Yeah.
Well, another issue with reunification, it seems that if eventually, who knows how long this would take, but if North and South Korea unified under Seoul, then there might be U.S. troops on China's border, which right now, maybe there are some in Mongolia, but very little. There's a significant U.S. troop presence in South Korea. How would China deal with, 10,000 U.S. troops hanging out on that border?
Yeah, well, I think that's open for debate because, you could argue that the discussions between Washington, Seoul, and Beijing, these kind of trilateral relations, yes, there are history problems, yes, there are territorial issues, right, in the sea. There are a lot of issues that anti-Korean racism in China, anti-Chinese racism in Korea, etc., and then, Washington wanting to do its thing. I would argue that it's certainly possible for there to be a unified Korea without American troops on the Yalu River. I mean, unless we've completely forgotten the hubris of Douglas MacArthur, and you're not going to see whoever is running American forces in the Far East, flying over the Yalu River in a surveillance craft, smoking a pipe like MacArthur was in 1950, arrogantly lording over the whole place. I mean, I think it's a radically different time. Chinese strategists themselves have talked about it's a new era. Land forces aren't what it's all about. If China has a strong navy, if China has a strong air force, it's not about the Americans pushing all the way to Changchun or Shenyang. So I think that it's possible that that's overblown a bit. This notion of Americans on the frontier, and of course the South Koreans would have a lot to say about that as well.
So you don't think the South Koreans, so you can see a scenario in which if Korea unified, there wouldn't be a need, or South Koreans wouldn't want Americans there anymore?
Well, it's certainly possible, isn't it? I mean, look at Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon reduced troop deployments in South Korea. Look at our relationship with Japan, the U.S.-Japan relationship. You could argue that there's plenty of Guam has been built up rather significantly. And so, I don't know, this notion that there eternally need to be American troops in Korea, particularly a unified and peaceful Korea, it gets back to strategic issues of trust and what is the U.S.-China relationship looking like, and we're back to Xi Jinping as well.
Well, I'd like to ask about another American who recently went to Korea. Dennis Rodman, the basketball player, spent more time with Kim Jong-un than any American that I know of. I mean, is there anyone else who has had that kind of access to Kim Jong-un than Dennis Rodman? Well,
there's Tony Nam-Kum, who is kind of a fixer who helped to set up the Google trip. But as far as I know, he hasn't met Kim Jong-un, and his access sort of is mainly with foreign ministry people, as I understand it. So I don't believe that Tony Nam-Kum has met Kim Jong-un. But they this goes back to North Korea's preference for strange sort of outliers. They sort of prefer to deal with non-government people. There's a guy who owned a rib shack in New Jersey, wrote a really fascinating book about, his high-level contacts with North Koreans. So I think this is a typical kind of Pyongyang diplomacy. You have the big gesture, everybody talks about it, and then you're obligated to do nothing.
So typical Pyongyang diplomacy is meeting with Dennis Rodman?
Well, it's typical in the sense that it's a wonderful gesture. It's dramatic. There's the theater state is alive and well in North Korea, and it's not about building functional relationships. It's not about setting up youth exchanges, for example. It's great for Dennis Rodman to go, and good for him. But where are the North Korean athletes coming to Atlanta? Where are the North Korean athletes coming? Being invited to the NBA Finals or whatever. I mean, I'm sure that the National Basketball Association is interested in, furthering these kind of discussions, but I don't think Dennis Rodman is their ultimate spokesman. And, the North Koreans have done the same thing to be a little more serious, with cultural diplomacy. Like, they sent a symphony orchestra to Paris last March, and it was a really great thing, and everybody played, Brahms together, and the Parisians loved it. And then, they came back home and it was all about, we played violin like a nuclear weapon, and we're going to launch this rocket soon, and everybody in Paris loves Kim Jong-un, and it's a bit horrifying.
So what have we learned about Kim Jong-un after Dennis Rodman met with him? Anything? I mean, does that in any way change your view?
No, it does, actually, yeah. I think he's more like his father than we previously thought. I mean, this is the interesting debate. You read articles by Vienna University professor Rudiger Frank, who writes at places like 38 North and others about the idea that Kim Il-sung, is the national founder, and Kim Jong-un maybe even has had surgery to look like this man, and there's a lot of let's go back to the 40s and 50s, and he does physically resemble his grandfather. But in terms of the state that he's inherited, in terms of the way that he projects power, how he sees the role of culture in North Korea, you could argue that he's largely his father's son, and he has this preference for kind of the grand gesture, the dramatic gesture. So he's kind of mingled his grandfather and his father's style, which is confusing.
I mean, on the one hand, they do have similarities. On the other hand, Kim Jong-il spoke in public once that we know of, right, in the early 90s, asking the military to persevere. And then after that, there's been no recordings that I'm aware of his voice, whereas Kim Jong-un, in his 13 months in power, has been a lot more public. He just seems a lot more comfortable in his own skin.
Yes, and I think that, not to bring up the Japanese imperial system here just randomly, I mean, I have a lot of problems. I have a lot of problems with how our friend B.R. Myers thinks that sort of North Korea is basically the heir to Japanese, wartime imperialism and racism and things like that. I think that's a bit exaggerated. But the idea that, he's a human, right? It's just sort of like the Japanese emperor after the 1940s who... mid-1940s, who sort of renounces his divinity, goes among the people, shows that he cares, but doesn't. I don't think it. What does that really change? It's cosmetic.
I'm not really sure what you're getting at there. So,
well, what I'm getting at is that Kim Jong-un is out, pressing the flesh. He's active. He's doing on-site inspections, which his father did, even though his father didn't give speeches. And what I'm saying is that if Kim Jong-un, it doesn't tell us necessarily about how he exercises power, about what kind of debate is going on inside of the country, what he's pushing for. I mean, for example, the Moranbong Band. This is a perfect example, Isaac, where he, invited them. They played.
Tell us who the band is. Because I don't think many people are familiar with the band.
Sure. Well, they should be, because they're a wonderful North Korean band of electronic violinists and electronic cellists. There's 3 violins and a cello, and then they have guitar, bass, a big red piano, a grand piano, and a couple of chord keyboards, a really awesome drummer who's quite talented, I must say, and then several singers, all of whom are probably married to very important military people or are seeing various generals. I mean, these are it's a high position that these people are in. But they were basically brought to light last summer when Kim Jong-un rolled them out and said, "This is my mark on culture. I'm pushing us forward into the new era." And basically, they played a couple of songs. They played the Rocky theme song. They played a lot of French music. They played a little sort of Baroque-sounding, Vivaldi-esque kind of. But then they also play a lot of old favorites about how to be good socialists. And they're well known because they wear kind of revealing clothing occasionally and a lot of jewelry. I mean, it's all about the elites in Pyongyang. It's entertainment for them. But they haven't been seen now for 3 months, so. Yeah.
Can you, that we're both on computers here, do you have a video of them? Can we play a 20-second clip of the Moranbong Band so people can get a taste of North Korean electronic violin music?
Yeah, I could find something on YouTube. That's for sure. Yeah, they have a wonderful kind of a. I think it's quite interesting from the North Korean standpoint that it's so. It's something new. You pack the stadium. You bring in lots of lights. You have guitar solos. There's a little bit of jazz occasionally, but they also signal things. And as our friends at NK News described, they also described they prefigured sort of some of the nuclear test discussion and the missile discussion, and they even sort of pretended to blow up the states. It's quite interesting.
Do you have a clip of the band that you can play for us?
Yeah, I think so. "Without a Break" is the name of the song. It is it's in celebration of their successful missile launch. And so, "Without a Break" by the Moranbong Band. And I'll maybe just play 20, 30 seconds of this. Is that what you're looking for?
20 seconds sounds great. Let's hear it.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about a statement that I think it was the North Korean military made recently about the South Korean president. South Korea, for the first time, has a female president. And they referred to her for the first time, but not by name. But they described the venomous swish of skirt in the Blue House in South Korea's government office. To me, that's a pretty intense phrase, but also surprisingly melodic. I mean, was that phrase communicated in English, or did they communicate it in Korean, and that's how it was translated?
Yeah, I think that it's Korean, and then they moved it over. I didn't get into to parsing that particular statement, so I'm not sure how it sounded in Korean or what the the intent of the insult was. You remember that Hillary Clinton was in English. It really worked, right? She was like an old pensioner, who was angry at North Korea, and so those kind of insults. Their English is kind of idiomatic, obviously. And so they insulted Hillary Clinton that way, and now they're insulting Park Geun-hye in this way. I'm frankly a bit surprised, though, that they haven't talked more about her father, who is, the ultimate symbol of kind of so much of what North Korea historically has really hated about South Korea. This, military dictatorship. He opposed Kim Il-sung in Manchuria in the 30s. I mean, this is a really crazy fact and coincidence that the grandson of Kim Il-sung is now the president, or the leader rather, of North Korea, and the daughter of Park Chung-hee, the famous dictator, is now in charge in South Korea. So it's kind of family feud on the Korean peninsula here.
Yeah, so I want to go back to these insults. I wrote a quick post about it yesterday, and they also called Condoleezza Rice a hen strutting around in the White House, crowing arrogantly, and a bitch running riot on the beach. And I'm wondering, I know they've said mean things about male Americans as well, but is there a particular gender bone to pick here? Or?
Well, I think that the tone of North Korean media it can get really brutal, and I think that you remember they had the dogs that came out. I don't think it's necessarily gender specific. I don't think that they're going after them specifically because they're women.
Adam, what are the dogs that you're referring to?
Well, the North Koreans brought out these German shepherds to literally rip apart, the previous South Korean president, Lee Myung-bak, in effigy.
And subtle. That was very subtle.
Yeah, very subtle. And I would argue that that's almost to scare people inside of North Korea. I mean, these dogs are pretty vicious. And they called him a rat, and the posters are really awful. And, one insult that a lot of people missed, Isaac, was an insult directed at Eric Schmidt of Google and Bill Richardson. They said, people come here, these well-dressed gentlemen come to North Korea and talk about human rights, but they have venereal disease, and we spit in their faces.
Wow, I did not realize North Korea said Eric Schmidt has venereal diseases.
Well, it was pretty strongly implied. Yep, there it was. Nodum Shinmun.
Did they imply it, or did they say that? I think this is worth parsing. Did they come out and say that he had venereal disease, or was it that people like him tend to, or how is it worded?
Well, it's all about you come here to our country, and you talk about morality, and you talk about human rights. Well, your society is disgusting, and you don't have any morality at all. And I don't know. The venereal disease thing sort of came out of nowhere. I was really quite shocked when I was sort of parsing the language. And then they said, and we spit in your faces. And I don't know if that means that they got upset that Bill Richardson or Eric Schmidt tried to give someone a lecture, maybe the vice foreign minister, about human rights or about letting out detained Americans like Kenneth Bae, who is still in prison in North Korea. He's a tour operator from Seattle. And Richardson was supposed to bring him out. And that didn't work. So I'm not sure exactly what's behind that. It's hard to, the other thing they do, though, is there's not a direct insult, right? So they talk about Westerners who come here and talk about human rights, and this is who they are, and we don't like them. And it's the same thing. Chinese leaders will come and talk to them, and then the next day, as you've written about, they start talking about the Kogoryo and the ancient, military victories over the Chinese back in the 6th and 7th centuries AD. So it's an indirect way, but it's really, really strong. And I think that the North Korean readers are clear as to what's going on. But I don't see it as being just sexism. I mean, it's pretty universal, hammer coming down on people who they want to criticize.
Are there any Americans that North Korean propaganda treats well?
Good question. They never talk about Noam Chomsky, for example. There's no Noam Chomsky. Let's see, thinking back to the Korean War, you had some Americans who wanted to spend more time in North Korea and in China after the Korean War, but they aren't treated particularly well. It's hard to think about, a positive example. I mean, that's why supposedly the Rodman visit is important, because, it humanizes the United States. Rodman gave 2 speeches in giant auditoriums. Well,
Wow.
He's standing up and Kim Jong-un is sitting, smiling, listening to him talk. I mean, that's, that's kind of a big deal, I would argue. I mean, if we're being humanized through Dennis Rodman, then, what the hell? That's, why not? I'm fine with that.
So what did Dennis Rodman say in his speeches, and how are his speeches covered in North Korean media?
Exactly. Well, they didn't do an exact translation. It's, there's a lot of voiceover. It was shown on the central TV station as, still photos with the announcer, being very excited, describing what happened at this event. I think he said things like, he was sad that the relationships between our 2 peoples, the North Korean and the U.S. American people, were not very good, and that there had been historical problems, and hopefully we can have more kind of people-to-people connection based on, mutual understanding of zone defense. I'm not sure where he went from there, but the basic message, Isaac, was, we should be seeing more of each other, and it's great to be here, and I love everybody, and everybody loves me. So. It was a very simple moment.
Very heartwarming. Very, very heartwarming.
Yes, always. Dennis Rodman, nothing like him.
So North Korea has said nothing about Noam Chomsky, or they've said nice things about Noam Chomsky? Or
I've seen very little. I mean, they talk a lot about poverty, and of course there was this sort of controversial tape recently, but it's there all the time. There's discussion of American violence. They cover the Sandy Hook shooting pretty, obviously they don't send reporters. AP doesn't have that kind of agreement with North Korea, where there's a KCNA bureau in New York, so they could cover this kind of thing. You don't have North Korean journalists abroad, unfortunately. But they keep bringing it up, and it's obviously a strong critique against the U.S. system. But they don't watch Democracy Now! They don't know who Amy Goodman is. They don't watch Noam Chomsky. I think that it's primarily used to critique, the states that. North Korea has a few friends, who are sympathetic to what the North Koreans are doing and why, but I would argue they really misuse their friends. They don't do a very good job of exercising soft power, and it's because they don't have long-term ties often. They're very curious and really interesting people like Felix Abt, the Swiss businessman who was in Pyongyang for 7 years. You have the Goethe Institute going back and forth. I mean, there are...
What is the Goethe Institute doing in North Korea?
Well, they brought an orchestra in recently. Munich Chamber Orchestra came in, and this is several years after they had to close their library in Pyongyang because nobody was going and that no one was allowed to be there. But you could argue that Kim Jong-un again has kind of sanctified or presided over a cultural opening to Germany, in particular Switzerland, but particularly Germany. So you have more German musicians going to Pyongyang, having master classes at the conservatory. There was a string, I think it's the Mendelssohn Octet, which is one of the great pieces of all time, that was played in a Haydn string quartet between North Korean and German mixed ensembles. So they're not as famous as Dennis Rodman, but I would argue they're just as important. And a performance of Beethoven's Ninth as well, which we wrote about at Sino-NK.com recently, where they, Beethoven's Ninth, North Korean orchestra, Japanese conductor singing in German about the brotherhood of man, while all this, hell is breaking loose in the news media, and they're talking about, coming to blows along the northern limit line. So, there's these are things we can't ignore. Also. Wow.
Well, thank you very much, Adam Cathcart, lecturer in history at Queen's University in Belfast and editor of the blog Sino-NK, who has given us a lot of information on a country that we just do not understand and does not want to be understood. I'm Isaac Stonefish with Foreign Policy Magazine in DC. Thanks for listening.